Here.
Here.
Representative Byron,
Here.
Representative Larson,
Here.
Representative Singh,
Here.
Representative Storer.
Excused.
I did see her. Vice Chairman Western,
Here.
Representative Winter,
Here.
Chairwoman Newsom.
Excused.
Excused. I think she's online.
Is she online?
She was initially.
Okay.
I'll mark her excused for now, though, and
Okay.
change it if she's online.
And Barb, just make sure to note that Representative Storer is here too. Thank you. Okay, folks, so a little recap. We had finished public testimony last Thursday, and so right now we're kind of moving into the set portion of the meeting where we work and discuss the bill. So committee, what's your pleasure? Moved by Representative Larson. Is there a second? Representative Angelos, thank you. Committee discussion? Chairman Burkhart.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Chairman, I have no real concerns with the technology in that, with this bill. However, I do have some with the way the bill is written. At one point, it references 23-1-302, A Romanet 2. It says establish zones, areas in which trophy game animals may be taken as game animals with a license or with the exception of gray wolves in the same manner as predatory animals without a license, giving proper regard to livestock, etc. So if I remember correctly, trophy game animals are mostly bears and mountain lions. And I guess I need to think about this because to me it appears that we've just given permission to somebody to take a mountain lion at night, which I don't think was the intent. The other question I had was we talk about public land with no real definition in here, unless I'm missing it, on public land, because all public land is not the same. So just my thoughts.
Committee, any discussion? Representative Burkhart, I don't necessarily think that it explicitly allows for the taking of trophy game animals, but I do see, I think, where is it, on page 3, it does talk about, represents public land. We can certainly entertain an amendment to clarify state and federal land as well. Okay.
Mr. Chairman, I don't have that amendment prepared on the lands, but again, state land, public land, BLM land, Bureau of Rec land, all those are all a little different, handled a little differently. I also see some issues, especially in the checkerboard area, the way the land is divided. And that's been a running battle of access for a number of years, so just some thoughts. And Mr. Chairman, as we go through the bill, I will have 2 amendments.
Okay. Well, committee, I suppose let's work the bill. The amendments on page 1, page 2.
Mr. Chairman,
Chairman Burkhart?
page 1, line 4, after night, insert as specified. And then this amendment carries over onto page 3, line 2, after commission, insert except between August 1 and actually the written copy you have says December 31st of each year, but it should be changed to January 31st of each year. Our big game hunting seasons are running that far now.
Okay.
So, and that's to keep a conflict that we discussed with last week over game animals versus predators, et cetera. and we can discuss it more if I get a second.
Seconded by Representative Larson. Further discussion? Chairman Burkhart?
Nope, I think that takes care of it. It prohibits the use specifically between August 1st and January 31st of each year because those coincide with our big game hunting seasons, both for archery and rifle.
Mr. Chairman?
Representative Storer?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Representative Burkhart, perhaps just articulating, except between August 1st and January 31st of the following year would be what you're.
That's a friendly amendment.
Any further discussion, committee, on the amendment? Sensing the urge to vote, all those in favor of the amendment say aye.
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 All those opposed say no.
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 That amendment is adopted. We are back on the bill. Representative Burkhart, do you want to take us through your, I guess, first make a motion for your second amendment?
Mr. Chairman. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'm on page 3, line 17, after commission, insert, the artificial light or lighting device shall allow a person to accurately discern and distinguish between similar but different species at a distance of at least 1,000 yards.
Is there a second? Representative Burkhart, I think that amendment dies for a lack of a second.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
We are back on the bill. Any further discussion, committee?
I'd like to move the suggested amendment that we talked about last week. But I don't think we had moved this yet.
We have not moved it.
Okay. This is a HB 104 suggested amendment discussed on Thursday.
So it's been moved before we can get to discussion. Seconded by Representative Larson. Representative Storer, go ahead.
Thank you, sir. This just provides the ability of the Game and Fish Department to provide some regulation of the use of such devices.
Committee, any further discussion? Representative Angelos?
I have a question, Mr. Chairman. So since we have passed the amendment, I'm reading Representative Burkhart's amendment. Is it going to contradict this amendment? Just based on, we are giving an exact date of when we have a start and an end, but yet on this one, on it, there's no specified date. We're actually allowing the commission to establish the rule and regulation.
Representative Angelos, I would concur that certainly if you look at line 2 of the amendment where the valid dates component, this certainly kind of jumps right in the middle of that and just kind of takes care of that and says through August 1 or August 1 through January 31 of the following year. It kind of sets that, which we can of course further discuss. Committee, any additional discussion on the amendment? Sensing the urge to vote, all those in favor? Yes, it was seconded. Representative Larson did. Sensing the urge to vote, all those in favor of the amendment say aye.
Aye.
Aye. All those opposed say no. That amendment is adopted. There might have to be some conforming language with that valid dates component. All right, we are back in the bill. If there's any further discussion, question being called. Barb, will you please call the roll?
Representative Angelos.
Aye.
Representative Burkhart.
No.
Representative Byron.
Aye.
Representative Larson.
Aye.
Representative Singh.
Aye.
Representative Storer.
No.
Vice Chairman Western.
Aye.
Representative Winter.
Aye.
And I don't see Chairman Newsom online, okay? 6 ayes, 2 noes, 1 excused.
House Bill 104 has passed the committee with a due pass recommendation. Representative Haraldson, I assume you'll be managing this on the floor? Excellent, thank you. The next bill for our consideration is House Bill 75. Representative Banks, hit us with your best shot.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, members of the committee. I bring to you today House Bill 75. This bill was brought to me on a recommendation by a group of landowners in my district who've had some problems with posting their property for trespass. You put the signs up, wind blows them off, animals scrape them off, people shoot them off. So they wanted another option. And so we got together and this bill was drafted by my predecessor actually last year. And then I did some tweaking to it and brought it back to you for consideration. So it starts here with the statutes on trespass. They're on page 2. And just goes into the current language and then adds there any one of the following. So Romanet I is personal communication. You're told you're trespassing. Romanet 2, which is not included here, is a sign that is no trespassing. And then we added in there Romanet 3, which is the meat of this bill, which is marking of a post or structure not less than 50 feet square inches of fluorescent orange or fluorescent pink paint. So that is an indication to passerbys, anybody going by the property, that that is private property. And then it goes into a little bit, including both sides of a body of water crossing property, wherever the body of water intersects an outer boundary line and regular intervals not less than 1/4. So metal fence posts, going on to page 3, when they're used, the entire post that's above the ground shall be marked so you can see it, so it's bright and noticeable. And then, of course, down there in section B, we're not going to use these posts where a public roadway enters or private property. We have private property on both sides. We're not going to use those posts that way when a public road enters. In the next section, it talks about the education part of it. So what's current is talking about, trespass. As a sportsman, it's my responsibility to know where private property is and where public property ends. And so with Onyx and such things, that is my responsibility to know, and I can know that way. But what we can include with this, the Game and Fish can, in their public media, as well as publication and things that they send off to us sportsmen, make the public aware of this change, that not only is it your right to know, but there's also going to be additions to posting property as private properties, signs, and then now these fluorescent fence posts, as well as state parks and recreation areas also. So those who are permitted to use that will also receive a publication letting people know that this is what's happening. If you see these bright fluorescent posts, then that is a indication that that is marking that area as private property. So this just help out our landowners who wanted another option, and it is an option. It's not saying you can't use whatever method you want. If you prefer the signs, you can still use the signs. But we recognize that those blow off, get shot full of bullet holes and such things. So having an added measure of posting your property as private property was what we were hoping to accomplish with this bill. And with that, I will stand for questions.
Thank you, Representative Banks. Committee, any questions? Well, I certainly have a couple. Representative Banks, could you kind of walk me through the rationale on page 3, lines 5 through 7?
Page 3.
That's sub-Romanet B. No fluorescent orange or fluorescent pink marking shall be used on posts or structures where a public roadway enters the property.
Right, so what happens now is the roadway is already marked for, it says, public roadway through private property, don't leave the highway, is basically what that indication is. So when your public road goes through there, it's, and where it, roadway enters, so it's just when you enter the property. So when you're inside past the entry of the public road, you could still put the posts on that side of the road. But when this was drafted, it was kind of felt like it would just be redundant because there's already a sign when the road goes through private property that says you're entering private property, stay on the road. So it was just, thought it might be redundant if you just had more postings along there, was the idea behind that, Mr. Chairman.
Representative Banks, one thing I was kind of thinking about maybe a little bit is, do you think that there's a chance that this might confuse sportsmen maybe a little bit? They say, okay, it's fluorescent pink or orange, this means it's private, don't go past there. But there's still a ton of signs out there across our state that are not fluorescent pink or orange. Do you think they might say, well, there wasn't orange, maybe I'm in the clear to go past this, this fence or this post or whatever it may be? That could be delineating the difference between public land and not. Do you think that confusion could be possible?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I think it is possible, and I think we see that a lot already with confusion of where you can and can't go. And I think that goes back also to the educating part. When you're sent your packet from state parks or game and fish or different things like that, and we can include in there an indication, hey, these posts indicate private property, just as a sign that says no trespassing does at this time. But again, I've always been under the impression that it's my responsibility to know. There's places where I hunt where there's no fences. I mean, there's not fences, there's no signs, there's not anything. And it jumps around between BLM, state ground, private property, and a lot of it isn't fenced. And so I have to, but it's still illegal if I go on there. So that aspect's not gonna change. This is just giving our property owners a second option to be able to mark their property. And I think it's I'm not going to assume, but I think most people, when they see something indicated like that that's out of the ordinary, a bright pink fence post, they might stop and say, hey, what's this all about? Is there something I need to know? And ask the question. And so we can't help everybody's lack of knowledge, but we can certainly do our part to educate people to know that this is now going to be in place.
And Representative Banks, another follow-up. There's some paint out there that really sticks over time and that doesn't wear. Certainly some of that neon pink and orange stuff, it can last quite a while, but these fences don't have to withstand years. They have to withstand decades and generations. Who's on the hook for making sure those things remain bright and clear and obvious for those sportsmen?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I think that responsibility would be on the property owner. So they indicate that that's their property. I think it'd be their responsibility to keep them updated and maintained, so it's clearly visible.
Okay. We'll start with Representative Storer, then Chairman Burkhart.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Representative Banks, I'm aware that I believe in Idaho, this is the practice. I'm just curious what other states, and did you look at their statutes to develop this bill? Thanks.
Mr. Chairman, thank you, Representative Strohr. Yes, Idaho and also Montana, two off the top of my head, and it was between those two states where I drafted this was based upon the practice that they now have in Idaho and Montana.
Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I guess I have a series of questions, if I may. Thank you. So Representative Banks, looking at page 2 and 3, Romanets 1, 3, A and B, if none of this is used, would this be considered an affirmative defense for someone who's trespassed?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Would this be used as, did I hear you right, an affirmative offense?
An affirmative defense in a case of trespassing?
And again, that goes back to, it's again, the right of the landowner to post their property as private, but it's not their responsibility to educate the public that it's their proper, or that it's no trespassing. It's my responsibility, say if I'm a sportsman or I'm a hiker or stuff like that, it's my responsibility to know where the public land ends and where the private land starts. So when they put up a fence post that's bright pink or put up a no trespass sign, that's now the current practice, that's just to let the public aware that it is private property, so that I don't have to go out and kick you off or things like that. It's just a mechanism of educating passerbys that this is where your right to be ends.
Follow up, Mr. Chairman.
Go
So
ahead.
maybe I'm not clear, Representative. So a landowner decides to not paint these fence posts. Their neighbor does. Somebody trespasses, and their defense is as well, we have all these posts up. I don't know where I'm at still because the posts don't say which side of it I'm on. Is that a defense in a case of trespassing, that they claim that they looked at the posts and they weren't painted? So obviously it's not private property when it really is.
Representative Banks?
So again, this is just an option of additional measures that can be taken. And again, it's the same argument that if I'm on your property, well, I didn't know it was your property, that doesn't hold up. And so that would remain with this legislation of if we have our bright pink posts up, it's just an additional measure. It still doesn't give anybody legal right to claim, I didn't know I was on your property because you didn't have your fence posts up.
Mr. Chairman, okay, so I'm on page 3, B. No fluorescent orange or fluorescent pink markings shall be used on posts or structures where public roadway enters the property. Why? I wasn't clear on that one.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman and Representative Burkhart. So basically, when we were drafting this, it was the same question I had. And when we got the draft, we looked into what's the current practice. And the current practice is when a public roadway goes through private property, there's signs that indicate that already. Say, roadway entering private property, stay on the road. And so it would just be redundant, I guess, to put that sign that says that with 2 bright pink fence posts there at the beginning. If we have a problem with that, I have no problem striking that section. It just was, seemed to be redundant, was why we added that into that. It wasn't necessary that we have those when the roadway enters, but you can have them after it enters your property if you wish.
Mr. Chairman, so I guess I just don't understand the need for this. And then we talked about educating people, and it says educate and inform all persons, and there are numerous uses of the word shall, and shall and all aren't necessarily compatible. considering it says all persons with hunting, fishing, trapping license or permits, including on any publication. I think that's a little overly broad. And so, thank you, Mr. Chairman, I'm done.
Any further discussion? Or questions, excuse me? Seeing none, appreciate Representative Banks. Stick around, because I'm sure we'll have more for you.
Okay, thank you.
First, let's go to state agencies. Game and Fish.
Good morning, Mr. Chairman. Brian Nesvik, Director, Wyoming Game and Fish. Chief Game Warden King has been the lead on this, and he's going to walk through your questions and any of our concerns with the bill.
Warden King, good to see you again.
Good to see you, Chairman Western, members of the committee. My name's Rick King. I'm Chief Game Warden for the Wyoming Game and Fish Department. Really, I think I'll just, in terms of the Title VI portion of this, I'll leave that aside because, as you well know, the Game and Fish Wardens do not have authority to enforce Title VI trespass. So I don't have any questions or comments there for you, but I essentially have three questions that I think, as we read this bill and trying to determine how we implement it and what this means for the agency, I think I have three questions, more or less. The first would be that this bill is very specific on page 3, line 15, that it directs us to inform and educate all persons on any publication. Of course, we produce a lot of publications, and perhaps some clarity there in terms of which publications this would be the best fit for may be helpful from our standpoint. The second question I have is that later on in page 3, line 19, it talks about informing other recreational users of this provision, and that we shall do so. Again, some clarity there would help us. Of course, our constituents are primarily hunters and anglers, et cetera, but other recreational users could imply quite a broad suite of folks, and some clarity there might be helpful. And then just lastly, on the very last portion about signs, it says the commission may develop and distribute signs, and some clarity there in terms of, would the commission be responsible for purchasing and paying for the development of those signs and distributing them? And have a little bit of concern just that could be quite an endeavor. There are many places across the state where roads intertwine between public and private property. And so some clarity there for the commission in terms of just are we to purchase and pay for these signs and distribute them? So just with that, again, just three questions that as we read this, as we think about how we implement this, those three questions came to mind. And with that, I would stand for any questions.
Committee members, have any questions for Game and Fish?
Mr. Chairman?
Representative Burkhart.
So, thank you, Mr. Chairman. So, Chief Warden King, as I look at this, the criminal trespass is in 63303, but then all of the requirements to educate, inform, et cetera, are in 231302. Does this confuse Game and Fish's rules on trespassing to hunt and fish versus criminal trespass? Is this blending them to a point where it makes it confusing?
Mr. King.
Chairman Western, Representative Burkhart, I don't think it confuses the elements of Title VI criminal trespass and trespass to hunt and fish. But as I mentioned, I do think some of the language in this 231302A, we, the commission or the department, could use some clarification in that regard in terms of how the department will implement this through the commission.
So, Mr. Chairman,
Nesvik.
just to be, I think I know where Representative Burkhart's going. So the elements of this bill deal specifically with the warning requirement in Title VI. So this would not impact game and fish trespass. It would still be a strict liability on the sportsman to know where they were, whether the posts were painted or not. This bill just contemplates meeting that requirement that you have to warn either verbally through the county sheriff or through some kind of a sign. So they are distinctly different.
Okay. Mr. Chairman, follow up? So, Director Warden King, looking at this, there's no fiscal note that I've seen with the bill. How much would it cost you to do all of this that you're required to do under 23-1302?
Mr. King?
Chairman Western, Representative Burkhart, really tough to put an estimate onto that. And I think the questions that I brought up here are along those lines of how do we implement this and what are the impacts for us? And some clarity there would help. As it is now, it'd be really tough to come up with an estimate for that.
Okay, thank you. Mr. Chairman, at some point, I have another question for the bringer of the bill.
We can
After we hear.
haul him back up here.
Okay.
Representative Winter, go ahead.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. It looks to me like that we need to address the fiscal note considerably here. When we expect the Game and Fish to provide these publications, we need to be able to provide the funding for that, and I don't see where that's addressed here.
Any additional questions? One question I did have, and again, we might have to bring Representative Banks up here just to clarify the intent of that component on Title 23, the powers and duties. I guess maybe a starting point is when I see that, I think the wide distribution, I think of this, the annual hunting regs that you guys send out every year to all sportsmen. I think it's everybody who is, every registered address that is connected with a conservation stamp, I believe. Is that how that works? My thought would be, I mean, you guys already have that in place. You know, I mean, how much do we spend a year printing those things out and putting them in the mailer? Do we, I mean, do you recall off the top of your head what that might be? Mr. King?
Representative Western, members of the committee, if you're just looking at our big game brochure for the primarily for deer, elk, and pronghorn, in the past, we've spent about $175,000 to print and distribute those. Last year, of course, we didn't have a printing company that was available to handle those, and so we had to go a totally different route. And last year's expenditures were significantly less because we produced and mailed far fewer brochures.
So, Mr. King, to clarify, the cost was much less, but that's because you mailed a lot fewer brochures because your vendors just couldn't fulfill the order.
Correct.
Okay. So that might be, committee, that'd be a good starting point if we do want to send out something along those lines. That might be at least some kind of in the ballpark. Obviously, once you get into the specifics of mailings, is it color? Is it, you know, what's it made of? How big is it? How many pages? Of course, that really all factors into the cost to give you guys some sort of frame of reference. Representative Burkhart, do you have another question?
Mr. Chairman, I do if we bring the sponsor back up at some point. I have a question for the sponsor, not the department.
Let's, I was inclined to maybe let Representative Banks have the last word before we close public testimony.
Vice
That's
Chairman
fine.
Western. Chairwoman Newsom has her hand raised.
Oh, Chairwoman Newsom, glad to have you here virtually.
She needs to turn on her microphone and her camera.
Sandy, can you hear us? If you can, let's unmute and turn on your camera. Quick restroom break. We'll come back to her in a minute. Any further questions for Game and Fish? Seeing none? Thank you very much. Any other state agencies? Go ahead. Again, please introduce yourself and the agency you represent.
Mr. Chairman and committee members, for the record, my name is Mark Gillette, Chief Engineer for the Wyoming Department of Transportation. Mr. Chairman, we do have a couple of concerns with this bill and one major question. The terms post structure and metal fence post is used throughout this bill. YDOT would really appreciate what the definition and location of those terms are. In other words, does fence posts mean posts in the right-of-way fence that will be painted? Or does the landowner have to drive in a post and paint it on his side of the right-of-way fence?
Representative Banks, do you want to come up and maybe answer that question? Would you mind restating that one more time, just in case?
Please.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Chairman. As you know, in Wyoming, YDOT is responsible for the construction and maintenance of the right-of-way fence along the state highway system. I'm not sure that's the case on other roads. So my question is what is the definition and location of the terms post structure or metal post? In other words, does that include the right-of-way fence?
Representative Banks, you want to take a crack at that?
I guess it could be. I mean, so it says here, square inch of fluorescent orange, fluorescent pink paint at each outer gate and normal point of access to the property. So I guess that could be interpreted if it is the right-of-way fence. But we can for sure change that wording if we got a problem with doing it on the right-of-way fences. I see no problem with that.
Is it Gillette?
Gillette.
Mr. Gillette. So if we were to amend some language saying that on roads that are, or I guess on posts or fence that are not directly on a state highway, would that clear up some ambiguity for you? For example, just some neon stakes demarcating public and private, that kind of thing.
Mr. Chairman, I believe that would clear up a lot of things as YDOT is responsible for construction and maintenance of that fence. And as a state asset, the right-of-way fence along state highways, in order for anyone to alter those, they'd have to get a permit and agreement with us to do so.
Thank you. Mr. Banks, I sense an amendment coming. Committee, any questions? Thank you very much. Appreciate it. Oh, sorry, go ahead.
Mr. Chairman, if I
Additional comment you want to
could,
make?
I just would like for everyone to know that in the manual on uniform traffic control devices, which is a national book for traffic control devices so that every state uses the same stop sign, so everybody knows what it is, or yield sign, et cetera. But in that book, they have color codes. And generally, pink means there's an incident, orange means construction. And so I think it would only behoove me to let you know that YDOT does use lath along the fence when we construct, or right before we construct, and we paint them orange. And typically, we will have lath by every cut and fill stake, which at times can get close to the right-of-way fence, that we paint orange. So just know that. And then also, Mr. Chairman, YDOT does paint fence posts yellow or white, denoting the beginning of a no passing zone and the end of a no passing zone for when our stripers paint the yellow barriers on the center line. They look over and they see a white post or a yellow post next to the fence or on the fence. And that's how we switch nozzles on our striper to end or begin a stripe, or a no passing zone, excuse me.
I've always wondered how that worked. Thank you.
And
Any
Mr.
questions?
Chairman, I would stand for questions. Those are my concerns.
Representative Angelos?
I have a question for you. Thanks for being here. When you say that you paint the lath, do you paint the entire length of the lath or just the top part?
Mr. Chairman.
Go ahead.
Generally, we usually paint pretty much the whole lath. Maybe not down below the grass, depending on how deep it is, but yeah, we'll paint the whole thing usually.
So one more
Follow-up,
question.
Representative?
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Chair. So lath being wood, and this would actually say that the post would need to be metal, if I'm correct in the bill, correct?
Mr. Gillette?
Again, Mr. Chairman, the way I read the bill, it is a post structure or a metal fence post.
Can I follow up, Mr. Chair?
Follow-up,
So
go
that's where the discrepancy needs to come in. You want to make sure it's clear it's either a metal post or a wood post, is that correct? Just so there's some differentiating with the lath being painted versus a metal post. Is that where you're going with on that?
Mr. Chairman, that was just information that I give you so that you're informed of how we do business inside the right of way. I don't know that it would be confusing to sportsmen or not. The lath we use is, 1/4 inch by inch and a half wide. It's not real big.
Follow-up? Committee, any further questions? Thank you very much. Appreciate it, Mr. Gillette. Anybody, any other state agencies? I don't think so. All right, let's go ahead to public comment. Mr. Magagna.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Jim McGaggan with the Wyoming Stock Growers Association and also representing the Wyoming Wool Growers Association today. This is a concept that we've suggested for a number of years that we believe has some merit to help eliminate so many of those scenarios where the issue becomes in a criminal trespass, did he know or not know whether he was authorized to do so? And this would help clarify that in many situations. So we're certainly very supportive of this. I would raise just a couple of questions. On page 2, lines 15, 16 talks about an outer gate or a normal point of access to the property. If we're thinking of fence property, that gate is probably the normal access. But in Wyoming, we have a lot of private land that is not fenced separate from public lands. And I have seen in at least one other state, and I don't recall that state now, where they provide, if you just have a property boundary between public and private land, that you can use this same approach and put a post so colored every so often. And I'm wondering here where down on line 18 and 19, or 19 and 20, I should say, talks about not less than 1/4 mile along property bordering a public road. Wondering if that perhaps could be expanded to say bordering public land, so that if you have a boundary with public land, if you put it every 1/4 mile or whatever you would deem to be the appropriate distancing, that would serve as notice as well, because people are traveling on that public land, not necessarily on a dedicated roadway, just traveling on, could be anything. It could be a horseback, could be a foot, it could be on a 2-track road, whatever that may be, and it would serve that function there as well. With that, Mr. Chairman, I'd be happy to take any questions.
Thank you, Mr. Magagna. Any questions? Representative Burkhart.
So, thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Magagna, about what's it cost to install a fence post for your members, for the average rancher in the state?
Just to install a
Mr.
fence
Magagna.
post, Mr. Chairman, Representative Burkhart, depending on the type of post, I think it could be done for as little as $5, let's say.
Okay, all right, thank you.
Representative
And follow up then. So if you look at the landowners in the checkerboard area, where they own every other square mile, and they alternate with BLM land, and some of that is, I know a couple ranchers, they have extensive holdings, and you know the ones I'm talking about. So even at $5 for a fence post every 1/4 mile and on the corners, I think that gets to be a pretty expensive proposition, don't you agree?
Mr. Chairman, Representative
Gagnon.
Burkhart, in checkerboard, that could be extremely expensive proposition. On the other hand, in an area where you simply have a parcel of private land adjoining parcel of public land, it could be done relatively cheaply. So it would be voluntary on the part of the landowner. And I think it's important to note that if a landowner opts not to put these up, that certainly is not a granting of access.
Okay, thank you.
Committee, any further questions for Mr. McGagnon? Seeing none? Thank you very much. Appreciate it. Next to testify.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman and members of the committee. My name is Sabrina King, and I'm here today with the Wyoming chapter of Backcountry Hunters and Anglers. We don't have a position on the bill per se. I think we understand the desire on the part of landowners to have clarity around criminal trespass. I think where we have some questions, and frankly, I think where we would like to see some things taken out of the bill, is as it pertains to the ask of Game and Fish. As has already been discussed, Game and Fish does not enforce criminal trespass. It does not enforce our criminal statutes. And so the entirety of the opening of this bill is about criminal trespass. So I think we have a fundamental question about why Game and Fish would be informing and spending, license and fee money on educating hunters about criminal trespass, which they don't enforce. I think there's probably potentially a broader question about the necessity of Game and Fish to educate hunters about both trespass, but also about the rights of hunters. So I think that is maybe a separate question, frankly. So as it pertains to this bill, I think we would simply ask that, when you get down to page 3, just take out lines 13 through page 4, line 5. Let the criminal trespass statute be the criminal trespass statute, and I think we can address the issues for hunters at another time. But I think the questions about how Game and Fish would enforce that, and frankly, the cost, again, of Game and Fish sort of printing up and distributing those signs, I think from our standpoint is not a cost that should come out of hunters' pockets, which is really where the Game and Fish money comes from.
Any questions for Ms. King? Seeing none? Thank you.
Thank you.
Anybody else who'd like to testify? Seeing none. Barb, is Sandy back on? Can you tell? Her hand is down. Okay. Seeing no further public comment, public testimony is closed. Mr. Banks, did you want to maybe actually get one last word in?
Sorry, her hand's back up.
Oh, her is. Okay, let's go ahead and let's get Sandy on. Or Chairwoman Newsom, excuse me. Chairwoman
Thank you.
Newsom.
Thank
Good to
you,
see
Vice Chairman Western. I had to step away to talk to my doctor for just a second, and so I did not know if there was any discussion as to why we would allow 2 colors, because in my mind, I would think, well, if it's orange, it means this, and if it's pink, it means something else. And so I didn't know if that was addressed in the course of the conversation that I missed. Thank you.
Representative Banks, would you like to address that?
Sure. Thank you, Chairman Newsom, for the question. That was just taken from both the states of Montana and Idaho. That's how they do it. And so I just adopted that practice into ours when I drafted this bill up.
Chairwoman Newsom, any follow-up?
No, but I would maybe suggest an amendment to choose one color or the other and not to have 2 colors, because I believe that leads to even more confusion. Thank you.
Thank you. Mr. Banks, or
Mr. Chairman,
Representative
are
Burkhart?
my follow-up questions appropriate at this point?
Go for it.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Chairman. So Representative Banks, a question. Talking about bodies of water, sportsmen's groups have spent a considerable amount of time and effort out of their own pocket to sign the North Platte River, because there's tremendous float there, and that, to sign them as to public and private land in a very definitive way. If you reach a red sign, you know you're traveling into private land. If you reach a green one, you know you're traveling into public land, so to speak. Does this affect that? Because now we're going to end up with 4 different colors. And that, do they need to go out and paint all those fence posts that are perpendicular to the North Platte River a different color and then try to indicate which side of the fence you're on.
Representative Banks?
I don't think so. Again, this is just an optional measure that some property owners can take. I certainly wouldn't advise taking the current ones down. That helps our anglers, and I don't see any reason why we would have to take those down. I think keep the practice as it is.
Follow up. And thank you, Mr. Chairman. And a similar question, I know of a number of places in my own district where you can travel a public road and you cross continually between public and private land, and public being various, whether it's state or Forest Service or BLM and that. And a perpendicular fence line on that is painted fluorescent orange. How do you determine what land you would be on if you got off the road? Unless you already know where you are.
Representative Banks?
So if you're traveling through a parcel of private property, there's indications, and I've seen it multiple times, that says private road, don't leave the road, or excuse me, public road, entering private land, don't leave the road. And so the indications would be that, well, I'm passing through private property, I'll just stay on the road and get through the property until I'm back on entering into public lands again.
Follow up, Mr. Chairman.
Go ahead.
Representative Banks, I know of a lot of roads that cross multiple ownerships that have no signage whatsoever on them. They don't even tell you what the route number is. How do you address that issue? It depends. I mean, if you know you're on private land and there's an orange line of fence post, you know you're probably going into public land, but it could be another landowner.
Representative Banks?
And it depends on the direction of travel.
And again, that goes back, we're not taking away any current practice. We're just allowing an option of, if you don't like your signs being blown off or animals rub them off, you can put fence posts up. So we're not giving anybody the right to go on property that they previously couldn't go on or things like that. We're not changing any of those kind of practices.
Committee, any questions? Seeing none. Thank you, Representative. Oh, or do you want a last word?
I was just gonna offer some options for amendments if we could. I know that we've had, I'll just explain why we added the powers and duties section down there. And it was simply to give, I know that there was some concerns about sportsmen with this. This was just added in there to say, if we want to, we can let people know that this is going on. I think we got some words in there that said this is their responsibility, they have to do it. I'm not against striking that out at all. It was just giving them a little bit of, if you want to let hunters and fishers know that this is a new practice, you can include it in your annual regulations or whatever. We don't have to have that. We can strike that. I have no problem with that at all. So that we can also in page 2, line 13, the good gentleman had some problems with or structure. We can scratch that too and just say marking of a post. If that helps with some clarification for people, that I offer those up as well.
Excellent. Thank you, Mr. Banks. Appreciate it, Representative. All right, public comment being closed. Committee, what's your pleasure? Bill has been moved. Is there a second? Is that Representative Storer? All right. Committee discussion on the bill. I certainly sense that there's some amendments floating around. Representative Burkhart?
Mr. Chairman, I really do have some issues with this, that we've combined in one bill, criminal trespass, powers and duties of the commission, and permits to use state parks. And I think I don't know, I think we've kind of gone in the wrong direction here. What I hear is, well, they can do this, but it's already covered by our laws. And usually when I've heard of these trespass issues, it comes from non-residents who whine and complain that they can't figure out where private and public land is. And I don't think that's really the case. You can buy any number of apps for your phone that tell you where you are within literally a few feet. So I really don't see where this bill is even needed. And we've dumped to Game and Fish and actually to our state parks, which we haven't talked about, a considerable expense to enforce criminal trespass, which really is in the, probably in the realm of our county sheriffs and that, because permits to use state parks, apartments shall educate and inform all persons, shall use public media. I think we've confused a number of issues here without a good solution. I appreciate the bringer of the bill bringing this subject, but I don't think we've adequately addressed it.
Committee, any further discussion? Representative Winter.
Yes, thank you, Mr. Chairman. I tend to agree with Representative Burkhart in that there's a lot of questions about this. Primarily, we're talking about painted posts going down a road, and it depends on which direction you're going as to where you're going to end up. So I think we need to, if we pursue this bill any further, we need to make some changes to further describe what we mean. And I'm just not sure that this bill is ready for prime time.
Representative Larson.
Thank you, Mr. Vice Chairman. I really appreciate the intent of the bill and the bringer of the bill for bringing up this subject. I just don't, I think there's so many amendments we have on our minds right now that we'd almost end up with a whole new bill by the time we're done. So I don't think I'll be able to support this bill.
Representative Storer.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'm gonna take a stab at an amendment and just see if we can narrow down the bill significantly. So I would, that amendment would be, we will have to change the language about what applies. So I haven't figured that out yet, but I would essentially do two things. As recommended by Mr. Magagna on page 2, line 20, delete a public road and just put public land. And then I think the place to consider YDOT's concerns about right-of-way fences would be on page 3, line 6, after the word structures, put in that are part of a publicly maintained right-of-way fence, comma, or. And then I would delete the rest of the bill. And I bring this amendment partly because I actually am a farmer in Idaho. I know that seems strange to some folks, but I own a piece of property. It does border a canyon that is public land. And we do have folks that, especially during hunting season, that come along on their ATVs. There's no real road there, but they come along the public land. And this is a way for me to let people know that they have permission, that they need to call for permission if they do want to come on the land. I have signs that say that, but the posts that I color orange actually do provide a good visual for them to see. They can see it from a much greater distance, and it does seem to work quite well. So again, I think most of the posts I see on my neighbors also are very clear to understand this is an area where it's mostly private land, but with some interspersed public land. And most of the posts aren't on the right-of-ways either. They are set back on the private land fences. We actually don't even have fences that keep people out. They've all been taken down, but we still have old posts, so we use those to paint. So in that case, I do see the effort that Representative Banks is trying to bring to help his constituents make it clearer for folks. Thank you.
So Representative Stewart, make sure I understand this correctly. On page 2, on 20, striking road, inserting land.
Or just, A, or deleting A too. So it reads public land rather than a public road.
Right. Yeah, that's be a conforming amendment. Then on page 3, line 6, after structures, inserting along a public road.
That says, so that no fluorescent orange or fluorescent pink marking shall be used on posts or structures that are part of a public right-of-way fence, is the intention there. Or where a public roadway
You
enters the
said
property.
publicly maintained
Publicly maintained, yeah.
right of way.
I would imagine if we just said public road, that would probably address YDOT's concerns, because they're the ones that are on the hook for maintaining those fences, but it's your discretion.
Mr. Chairman, I believe the issue is whether it's on their right-of-way fences rather than along the road. We could ask for clarification.
Mr. Light, go ahead. Please.
Mr. Chairman, YDOT's responsible for any asset inside the highway right-of-way. So I think to answer that question best, it would be much simpler and very clarifying for YDOT if the rancher could put the post on his side of the right-of-way fence,
Right.
if I understand the question, not inside the right-of-way fence along the road.
So that are outside of a publicly maintained right-of-way fence would be the right language then?
Yeah, Mr. Chairman, we typically put our fence 1 foot inside the actual property line, just to be sure that we're on our side of the property. But I would say, anywhere on his side of the right-of-way fence, the private landowner's side of the right-of-way fence.
Thank you. Representative, is that?
Yeah, that's fine.
And then third part of it is to strike all the language past line 8 on page 3.
Correct.
Correct. And leave the enacting date in.
Yes.
All right. Barb, do you have that?
So, well, line 6, you wanted to change, that is part to, how did you want that to read exactly? On line 6, page 3. After structures.
That are outside a publicly maintained, that are,
outside
well,
of
but it
a
says,
publicly maintained right
or
of way.
well, it starts out as a negative, so. That are within. Right, but the sentence starts with no. So,
You could say within
yeah, I think the within.
the
So that are
right-of-way.
within the Y-top, a publicly maintained right-of-way fence.
So adding the word fence at the end? Right of way.
Yes, right-of-way fence. Or, yeah, we could just say the right-of-way, since the right-of-way is a foot out.
So no fence.
Correct.
And then striking the rest of that from line 8 on page 3 all the way to line 3 on page 5.
Correct.
You got that, Barb?
Through line 3 or through line 5?
Through line 3 on page 5, because that will still have to leave the effective date in there.
And we would also delete on page 1, line 12 after the comma,
Correct.
line 13, and line 14 subsection U.
I'd love to have a copy of
Okay.
what you've done.
Well,
Liz,
let's see if we,
If you wouldn't mind, maybe before we go back up, would you just get together at Bar before we
sure.
even just kind of make sure I think we're all
We'll see whether,
conceptually on the same page. All right. Any further discussion on the amendment? Sorry, Representative Winter.
Yes, thank you, Mr. Chairman. I would speak against this amendment, at least in the portion that says we would eliminate the portion relative to the commission. I think they need to be involved in this now and whatever happens. I think they're important to maintain the value of these laws, and it helps our public land users to understand better what they're getting at here. So I would hate to eliminate that portion.
Representative Angelos?
I would tend to agree with that. I also think we need to decide on a color. Being someone who would be very confused by color, we need to pick one. So, but I would agree with Representative Winters on that. I think this bill is great. I love the intent. I think it needs a lot more work to make sure it's solidified on both ends.
Any further discussion on the amendment?
Mr. Chairman, I think I missed who seconded that amendment.
Yes, that's right. Was there a second? Did you second it? No. Was there a second?
no, mine.
The Storer amendment. Is there a second? Looks like that amendment dies for lack of a second. We are back on the bill. Any further discussion or amendments?
I would like to make an amendment.
Representative Singh?
So, thank you, Mr. Chairman. On page 2, line 20, just strike road and replace it with land.
Including A.
And A, yeah.
All right. Is there a second? Representative Storer?
Sorry, I didn't quite hear.
That was
Representative
part of what you had previously.
Singh. Just
first
the
part.
line 20
Yes.
change. I'll second.
It has been seconded. Is there discussion? Since you're urged to vote, all those in favor of the amendment, say aye.
Aye.
All those opposed, say no. That amendment is adopted. We're back on the bill.
I have a proposed amendment.
Representative Byron?
Thank you, Chairman. I think the easiest way, and I've highlighted the numbers, but the easiest way to go about this is just to strike or fluorescent pink paint throughout the entire bill. I know there's specific language that we were advised to use for that, and I can go through line by line that I have found. Or we can just go with the general concept.
I think unless we want to go in depth, I think we're all,
And
do we all understand the proposed amendment? Is there a second? Seconded by Larson. Any discussion on the amendment? Sensing the urge to vote, all those in favor of the amendment say aye.
Aye.
Those opposed, no. That amendment is adopted. Barb, do you? Yes, make sure to get together with Barb before we take off. All right, any further questions or discussion or amendments? Seeing none?
Mr. Chairman.
Representative Byron?
Mr. Chairman, I also really appreciate the bringer of the bill's intent here and urge the committee to consider moving forward with it, even though it does need to be highly marked up with some of the amendments we've made and further amendments. So, I know this is a tough one, and it was mentioned it wasn't ready for prime time. I think the appetite is there, and I would urge, as much as it can be conflicting, given what the work that has to be done by the great Representative Banks, I think I will be moving forward in favor of this.
Sensing the urge to vote, Barb, would you please call the roll?
Representative Angelos?
No.
Representative Burkhart?
No.
Representative Byron?
Aye.
Representative Larson?
No.
Representative Singh?
Aye.
Representative Storer?
Aye.
Vice Chairman Western?
Aye.
Representative Winter?
No.
Chairman Newsom? I will mark excused.
Excused.
It's 4-4.
That bill dies on a tie vote. Thank you for your time, Representative Banks. The next bill for consideration is House Bill 147. Obviously, we're not going to get through this bill in 30 minutes, given the attention is garnered. But at the very least, let's kind of start with a walkthrough and see if we can get through at least state agencies and some of the public testimony. So, Representative Provenza.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman and committee. I bring to you today for your hopeful favorable consideration, or I guess maybe review, Mr. Chairman, House Bill 147, unlawful trespass signage, taking of wildlife. Committee, this bill was brought after it came to my attention from constituents and personal experiences that folks are running into private land or private property signs when they're out hunting on land that is clearly not private. It is public, it's accessible by the public, and they would otherwise be able to hunt there. I can imagine that there are several of you that hunt, but in walking you through kind of what that looks like in the field, hunter goes out, they're chasing an elk, maybe they're creeping through the forest or crawling over a knob, and they are going to go after an elk, and they run into an unexpected private property sign. The hunter at that point has to make a decision of, they might look at OnX, and certainly folks have said, well, we've got so much GPS that we don't need to worry about it. People know where the lines are. But as a new hunter or someone who is very concerned about not losing those hunting rights, I think the concern has been, well, I don't want to accidentally kind of infringe on those private property rights, potentially lose my ability to hunt. And so it might get in the way of an active hunt. Maybe you're on the way to an elk, or just chase whatever. But that's the genesis of the bill. And this is something that I've heard from folks across the state, plenty of hunters that I've spoken with. And it's something that I've kind of long known about, even across state lines, as I different lifetime, maybe 5 or 6 different lifetimes ago, I helped work and lived on a 3,500 acre ranch that was up by some public lands. And so there's some frustration that maybe folks who are unlawfully doing this, who are intentionally trying to claim public land as their own private land, give good landowners a bad name. And so that's where this bill is coming from. And certainly, if you look at our state constitution, Article 1, Section 39, we have the opportunity to fish, hunt, and trap wildlife. It is a heritage that shall forever be preserved to the individual citizens of this state. And I would argue that we have a gap in our laws that we need to close so that we can ensure that constitutional right. So I'll just walk you real quick through the bill. Clearly, it's 150 pages, so it's going to take me a minute. But what House Bill 147 does is it's amending current statute that deals with interference with lawful taking of wildlife. So any attempt to try and keep folks from taking wildlife lawfully. And so the current language on page 2, where we have paragraph A, no person shall, with the intent to prevent or hinder the lawful taking of any wildlife. And then it ends up saying that knowingly and without authorization, post signs that restrict access to or use of state or federal land on which the lawful taking. So we're trying to make sure that there is something in there so that in our Title 23 game and fish statutes can be enforceable. And then under paragraph G, numerat 3, this provides a protection for landowners. We don't necessarily want to accidentally give a gotcha moment for landowners, right? If they are knowingly doing something or they are intentionally trying to stop hunting and claiming public property as their own, that is the intention. We don't want to have any accidental or just a different frame of mind. So that has been inserted to help kind of protect the landowners as well. that is the bill. I'm sure you can hear some other testimony today, but yeah, I'm happy to take any questions, Mr. Chairman.
Committee, any questions?
Mr. Chairman?
Representative Burkhart.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. So Representative Benza, in the eastern part of the state, it was settled first, pretty much. And in those days, landowners took a little extra land off the section line. I know of some places where it's about 100 yards or more into the adjoining section. So that fence line has been there for 100 years. I mean, just go look at the post and they'll tell you that. So a landowner posts the land as no trespassing. Will they be guilty of violating this, considering that sign is set, sometimes 100 yards outside their own property?
Representative Provenza.
Mr. Chairman, thank you. And thank you, Representative Burkhart, for the question. I think you bring in the question of intent. Are they intending to stop that lawful hunting? Perhaps one could zealously go after that. Game and Fish would still have some discretion. And I think that leaning on that, again, looking at, is the intent to keep folks from being able to lawfully hunt? In that instance, I don't know that it is. So I think it's a good question, one that maybe we should ask other folks. But that would be my interpretation as to that specific circumstance.
Mr. Chairman, follow up?
Representative Burkhart.
So Representative Provenza, what I'm getting at is, could this be used in effect to force a landowner to survey that land and then re-fence it? Considering last time I put up fencing, it was 10,000 mile. I mean, that could be very expensive. So just curiosity question on that.
Representative Provenza.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Representative Burkhart. It's an interesting problem that I don't have the answer to. I think there's potentially we could look at, is there a way to grandfather or make account for this so that we're not doing that? Because it's certainly not my intent. And how can we kind of work with landowners on what makes sense? So that is a good question I think you should pose to other folks who might be testifying that might have a better idea of how to answer that.
Committee, any further questions? No, I've certainly got one. Representative Provenza, on page 2, line 12, Roman 3 says, not interfere with any landowner's right to prevent criminal trespass in the landowner's private property. Obviously, our statute makes a pretty clear distinction between criminal trespass and hunter trespass. Was hunter trespass intentionally excluded, or was that just kind of an oversight? Would you welcome an amendment to include that in there? What's your thoughts there?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Good question. So we put these statutes here in Title 23 very specifically. If I wouldn't be opposed to that because we're not trying to meddle in Title 6. This was very much meant to be Title 23. It's a hunter and angler issue, and we don't want to necessarily kind of meddle the waters that we have with some of the interpretation of criminal versus hunter trespass. And part of the other rationale for keeping it in Title 23 was, a lot of Game and Fish funding comes from hunters and anglers. And so it makes sense that if they're in the field having issues, that they can call that agency to kind of help with some of the problems. So I don't see an issue at this time with that, Mr. Chairman. Yeah.
Any questions? Excellent. Well, thank you very much, Representative. Obviously, stick around in case we have more. All right, we will go to state agencies. Game and Fish. Mr. King.
Chairman Western, members of the committee, I'll make my comments very brief, as I'm sure there are members of the public that would like to testify. I would just point out two things. This putting up a sign on federal land is already prohibited by federal law. And the other thing that I would point out is it was mentioned that by placing this in Title 23, the scope is very much limited to just those folks whose activity of lawful taking of wildlife would be impacted. And I just bring that up so that it's clear that if a dog walker or a hiker or somebody else encountered one of these signs, the department, Game and Fish Department law enforcement officers would not have any authority or ability to address those particular situations. This would certainly just be limited in scope to the interference of lawful taking of wildlife. So with that, I'll stand for any questions that you might have.
Committee, any questions? Seeing none, appreciate it. Stick around just in case we have more questions.
Thank you.
Any other state agencies wish to testify? All right, let's go ahead to public comment. Go for it. Just make sure to state your name and who you're here on behalf of.
Thank you for the opportunity to testify. Chairman Western, members of the committee, Buzz Heddick, and I'm out of Laramie, Wyoming. Also a co-chair for Backcountry Hunters and Anglers. Mr. Chairman, would it be okay if I distribute a picture real fast to the committee?
Sure, go ahead.
Start it here, you guys can all take one pass around. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. So I'll make
Go
this
ahead.
story really brief. I, in about 2016, applied with an elk tag north of Casper in Unit 122. There's a landowner there named Doug Cooper that I contacted because I knew he has, in the past, had conflicts with hunters. So I thought the best approach would be to contact him and let him know that I was going to be hunting there. So this happened off the Ormsby Road, just north of Casper. I offered him also to stop by my wall tent. I told him right where I was going to camp. I told him the specific sections I was going to be hunting for elk with my friend from Montana. So I went there on opening day and hunted, no problem. My friend and I went back a few weeks later, about a week later, and this sign was in the middle of the county road. That was specifically to keep me out of there. And what I did there is luckily I had cell coverage. I sent that picture to a friend of mine, Jeff Muratori in Casper. He contacted the county sheriff, talked to the county sheriff. He said, ignore the sign, go ahead and go do your hunt. So I did. I went back behind there. My friend and I both killed elk back in there. But this is the kind of thing that this bill is trying to address. I don't appreciate having my public lands blocked like this. It's not appropriate, it's not fair, it's dishonest, and I want to have a remedy for that. So with that, I would take any questions.
Committee, any questions for Mr. Heddick? Seeing none, thank you very much for your testimony. We appreciate it.
Thank you.
You're also welcome to send the exact location pin to the TESA committee of where those elk were too. That is most welcome. Any other public comment? Go ahead. Again, please just make sure to state your name and who you're here on behalf of.
Hi, my name is Nick Mahon. I'm here on behalf of myself. Thank you for the opportunity to testify. So, access to public land is the single most important part of enriching the lives of my family and friends. We hunt for food, teach our kids about ethics and game management, respect for the land, and simply to enjoy wild places. These opportunities are afforded to us because of the people who sit in this room and have done so for generations to fight for public land. This bill is simple, it's not a novel concept, and it benefits everyone. I fully respect landowners and the right that they have, the rights that come with owning private property, and with all humans, 99% are salt of the earth people. However, there are a select few that choose to unlawfully oppress others and have been doing so for a long time. When I was in high school, 25 years ago, we'd pick up a BLM map, methodically map the distance, reset the odometer in our truck, and drive in to try to find the state section. Wasn't a great way of doing things because we never knew exactly where we were until you walked a compass line to find the corner marker. I was harassed by two different people on separate occasions from the Flying X Ranch in Halleck Canyon. They claimed that I was on their land, told me to leave. They'd point to their sign for justification. Being young, I didn't want to get in trouble with the game warden or the sheriff. So, as they suggested, I just left. It wasn't until later in life that I discovered that they just simply put their sign on state land. Today, it's effortless. Most hunters know their exact location overlaid on a surface ownership map, accessible by fingertip at any time. Knowing exactly where you are still doesn't stop people. 2 years ago, I was on Tunnel Road in Albany County, where a 600-yard stretch of road crosses a 1,200-acre parcel of state land. Plenty of room to pull off and legally hunt. A guide with 2 clients threatened me with physical violence for being on private land that he had leased for outfitting. When challenged with an updated Onyx map showing exactly where I was, he pointed to a sign and said that that land was his, that it wasn't accessible by the public. This was a small stretch of 2-track that they chose to put their sign on private property, but indicating the intent not to pass onto public. Not everyone chooses to diffuse these situations as I did, by just simply leaving. These altercations can become violent. Most hunters are carrying weapons when they're being threatened. It's not a good situation. This bill has the chance to explicitly say that people can't do this, that they can't restrict access to state and federal lands. It's critical that the state sees this as a way to give law enforcement the language they need to act on, and more importantly, prevent potentially forceful disputes from occurring in the future. So thank you very much for your time and consideration. I'll take any questions.
Thank you, Mr. Mayha. Did I pronounce that correctly?
Yeah.
Thank you. Committee, any questions? Seeing none? Thank you.
Thanks.
Any further public testimony here in the room?
Mr. Chair, I would testify, but I would also defer to other folks if we're going to be testifying. Happy to let other folks who can't come to testify.
Anybody else in the room? We've got a handful online.
We have 3 people with hands up.
Okay, who's the first one?
Jacob Weiss.
Okay, let's let him in. Jacob, can you hear us? If you can, I need you to unmute your microphone, turn on your camera, and announce your name and who you're with.
He may only have audio. Oh, no, there.
We can hear you loud and clear.
All right. Good afternoon, Chairman Western and members of the committee. My name is Jacob Weiss. I'm a resident of Cody, Wyoming, and I'm here today representing myself and fellow hunters of Wyoming to speak in favor of House Bill 147. Some of my earliest memories as a kid involved driving around with my dad on Wyoming dirt roads, holding a Wyoming gazetteer, following a path on a map, determining what roads and lands were public or private. Over the decades of doing this, I've encountered multiple instances of public roads on public land that were marked improperly, gated or locked, no trespassing signs. Notably, this last fall, I was assisting my wife on an antelope hunt in the area surrounding KC. We were on a BLM road, smack dab in the middle of Wyoming state trust land. We encountered a gate that had 4 or 5 signs on it, hodgepodge of, a ranch name, verbiage that included no trespassing, stay on the road, etc. Now I confirm with various GPS-based mapping systems that we were indeed on public land, the road is public, and that we never trespassed to get to this location. Now I have the knowledge and resources to know that these signs don't hold water, but as other people have testified, there's sometimes some physical persuasion that happens. And I could see how other people, Wyoming's many new adult onset hunters could get persuaded by these scare tactics and be deprived of a hunting experience on our cherished Wyoming public lands. I'm a staunch supporter of private property rights. And, I was appreciative that the bill did include language that protects the landowner's right to prevent trespass. I did also notice and have an issue with the whole criminal trespass versus hunter trespass, and would definitely encourage some discussion to clarify that, as it's, critical in this bill. And I know that the fine men and women in red shirts wear a lot of hats, assume many roles as both wildlife officers and law enforcement. But I think this is a critical issue that, will help keep the integrity of Wyoming's public lands, held for public use. And I would ask you to please support House Bill 147. And thank you so much for your time, and happy to answer any questions that come up.
Committee, any questions? Seeing none. Thank you, Mr. Weitz. Appreciate your testimony. Barb, who else do we have?
Josh Metten.
Okay, let's go ahead and let him in. Josh, if you can hear us, go ahead, state your name and who you're with.
Chairman Western and members of the committee. My name is Josh Metten with the Theodore Roosevelt Conservation Partnership. Thank you for the opportunity to comment on this bill today. We're in favor of it. As we've heard from some other testimony today, this is an issue that occurs across the state, and we see this bill as being an opportunity to improve access to public lands while also respecting private property rights. That's an important part of our mission to guarantee all Americans quality places to hunt and fish. Hunter harassment bills are often, hunter harassment issues today are increasingly centered around access to public land. And we need to improve this. So this bill, along with others being heard this session dealing with trespass, are about being good neighbors. As we've heard before, most people are good actors, whether they're public land users or landowners. We support improving ways to discourage the bad actors. This is an issue across the state. I've been talking with hunters and anglers and in many different areas that are all providing examples of how this is happening to them, including Darby and Lee Canyons on the west slope of the Tetons, over in the Powder River Basin, down in KC, as we just previously heard. We support expanding the toolkit available to wildlife managers to help and land managers to help reduce conflict surrounding public land access. Thank you, and I stand for questions.
Thank you, Mr. Metten. Committee, any questions? Seeing none. Mr. Metten, we appreciate your testimony. Thank you.
Zachary Dorr.
Let's go ahead and let him in.
He needs to unmute and start his camera.
Zach, can you hear us? If you can, please unmute and turn your camera on. Zach, can you hear us? Sounds like we might have some technical difficulties there. Barb, is there anybody else online? Let's go ahead and let John in. John, can you hear us? If you can you?
Can you hear me now?
We got you. John, we're in a little bit of a pinch. We have to gavel back in about 8 minutes, so you could just keep your
keep it short and
testimony.
sweet.
Please, thank you.
Okay, so this is important to me because
If you could just
I grew
state
up
your
in
name
Wyoming.
quickly and who you're with.
Sorry. John Grant, I'm with myself, probably half of the other hunters and anglers in Wyoming. So twice while I was hunting in Wyoming off Marshall Road, there's a piece of BLM land there. It's got a single fence post on a 2-track right in the middle of the 2-track that has a no trespassing sign on it. me and my son walked in about a mile and a half to harvest elk that we had seen from the road, but there's no marked road on that piece of public. It's a piece of BLM land, and we walked in and tried to harvest an elk. And while we were trying to get within an ethical range of these elk, we heard an ATV approaching, came over the hill. It was the landowner on his UTV, and he chased the elk off of his public land onto his private land, and then came back and violently was screaming at us and just kind of being absurd about the whole situation. He threatened to call the sheriff. We knew we were on public land because of OnX and our GPS, and walked back to the truck, drove down the road, got a hold of the sheriff, found out he never really called the sheriff because I think he knew he was in the wrong. But this has come up time and time again in hunting in central Wyoming for me, and that's why it's important to me. I have nothing else.
Well, thank you, Mr. Grant. Any questions, committee? Seeing none, thank you very much for your testimony. We appreciate your time.
Thank you.
We could probably squeeze one more in before we close public comment. Go ahead and let him in. Mr. Jensen, can you hear us?
I sure can.
So we've got about 5 minutes before we have to gavel back in. So if you wouldn't mind, maybe just make your testimony short and sweet, if that's okay.
I will. Thank you, Chairman Western. My name is Levi Jensen from Gillette, Wyoming. I run into a couple situations like previous speakers have mentioned, both on federal land, signs in inappropriate places. I just want to speak real quickly to one point or question that's been brought up previously on existing federal laws that would prohibit a leaseholder or any private person from putting a sign up like this. Both cases, one was on the I guess it'd be Forest Service. It was the Thunder Basin National Grasslands property, and the other one was in BLM. One in Campbell County and one in Douglas, I believe, or Converse County. It worked out pretty well for me on the one on the Thunder Basin National Grasslands. I had a deer tag there 2 years ago, and I called that one in after the season. And it took me a while to get hold of the right person within the Forest Service, within that organization. And, they said they look into it. I happened to draw an elk tag for the same unit the following year, this past fall, and went out, and that sign was moved or eliminated. It wasn't there anymore. And then in the other place was on BLM up in the Fortification Creek area in Campbell County. And, it took me a while to get in touch with the right law enforcement personnel with BLM, but I finally did. And, that was a couple years ago. And so I haven't been back up to that same particular location since then to see if that sign got taken down. But in both cases, it's hard to get in touch with the right person. And at minimum, it takes a long time to get those situations rectified. I'd like to see, or I guess the benefit I see of this bill is timing, to help with having game and fish personnel, game wardens out in the field during the hunting season to, stop these situations from coming up, stop these situations from escalating into, physical violence or threats or things of that nature. It would help from that regard. And with that, I'd stand for any questions that you might have.
Thank you very much, Mr. Jensen. Any questions, committee? Seeing none, thank you for your time, for your testimony.
Thank you.
So committee, I think probably just going to go ahead and roll this over into Thursday. We're going to go ahead and close public testimony. So when we come back on Thursday, we're just going to come right back in, start working the bill, and just kind of go from there. So thank you very much for your time. Public testimony is closed, and we are adjourned till Thursday. Thank you.